In the mists of time, long before the sun would never set upon its dominions, the British Isles lay shrouded in Celtic mystery and Roman ambition. The story of the British Empire begins not with conquest abroad, but with conquest at home, as wave after wave of invaders shaped the character of a people who would one day rule the waves. The Romans came first, their eagles gleaming in the northern fog, as Julius Caesar's legions crossed the treacherous waters of the English Channel in 55 BC. Though Caesar's initial forays were brief, they marked the beginning of Britain's long relationship with continental power. Under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, the Romans returned with determination, establishing Londinium upon the Thames and pushing their civilization deep into the heart of what would become England. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman rule brought roads that stretched like veins across the landscape, cities that rose from Celtic settlements, and a legacy of organization that would echo through the ages. Yet even as Rome imposed its will, the unconquered north remained wild and free. Hadrian's Wall, that mighty stone serpent stretching from sea to sea, stood as testament to the limits of Roman power. Beyond it, the Picts and Scots maintained their independence, their painted warriors a constant reminder that not all of Britain would bow to foreign rule. This defiant spirit, this refusal to be completely subdued, would become a defining characteristic of the British character. When Rome's grip finally loosened in the early 5th century, the legions departed, leaving behind a Romano-British population suddenly vulnerable to new threats. From across the North Sea came the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes Germanic tribes, seeking new lands as the Old World crumbled. These Anglo-Saxon invaders did not merely conquer, they transformed, bringing with them a language that would one day span the globe and customs that would shape a nation's soul. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that emerged from this chaos, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and their smaller neighbors, engaged in constant warfare, each seeking dominance over the others. Yet from this seemingly endless conflict arose remarkable achievements. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded their deeds for posterity, while poets sang of heroes like Beowulf in mead halls, warmed by hearth fires. Christianity, brought by missionaries like Augustine of Canterbury, began to weave its way through the fabric of Anglo-Saxon society, adding another layer to the complex cultural foundation that was forming. King Alfred the Great of Wessex, who ruled from 871 to 899, embodied the emerging English spirit. Faced with Viking invasions that threatened to overwhelm his kingdom, Alfred did not merely resist. He adapted, learned, and ultimately triumphed. He established a navy, reorganized his army, and created a system of fortified towns called burhs that could withstand siege. More importantly, he fostered learning and law, translating Latin texts into the vernacular and establishing a legal code that would influence English jurisprudence for centuries to come. Alfred's victory over the Vikings at Edington in 878 marked not just a military triumph, but the preservation of English independence and culture. The Viking Age brought both terror and transformation to the British Isles. Danish great armies swept across the land, establishing the Danelaw in northern and eastern England, while Norwegian Vikings settled in Scotland and Ireland. Yet these Scandinavian invaders were not merely destroyers. They were traders, explorers, and settlers who brought new technologies, trade routes, and cultural practices. The Vikings' mastery of the seas would inspire later generations of English mariners, while their entrepreneurial spirit contributed to the commercial foundations of future empire. Under Alfred's successors, particularly Edward the Elder and Athelstan, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms gradually united under West Saxon leadership. Athelstan's victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 established English supremacy over the other peoples of Britain, earning him recognition as the first true king of England. This unification created a sense of English identity that transcended tribal boundaries. laying the groundwork for future expansion. The Norman conquest of 1066 represents perhaps the most dramatic transformation in English history. When William the Conqueror's army met Harold Godwinson's forces at Hastings, the fate of England hung in the balance. Harold's death, beneath the Norman lances, marked not just the end of Anglo-Saxon rule, but the beginning of England's integration into the broader European world. The Normans brought with them continental connections, architectural innovations, and administrative systems that would strengthen the English state. Under Norman rule, England underwent a revolutionary transformation. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, represented an unprecedented survey of the kingdom's resources, demonstrating the new ruler's administrative sophistication. Norman castles rose across the landscape, stone symbols of foreign domination that gradually became centers of English power. The Norman nobility, initially foreign oppressors, slowly merged with their Anglo-Saxon subjects, through marriage and time creating a new Anglo-Norman aristocracy. The Angevin Empire established when Henry II ascended the English throne in 1154, stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, encompassing England, much of France, and parts of Ireland. This vast continental empire made England a major European power and provided the resources and connections that would prove crucial in later imperial expansion. Henry's legal reforms, particularly the establishment of common law, created a unified legal system that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world. The conquest of Ireland began under Henry II, marking England's first major colonial venture. Anglo-Norman lords carved out territories in the eastern and southern parts of the island, establishing the Pale around Dublin and introducing English law and customs. Though never completely successful, the Irish venture provided valuable lessons in colonial administration and control that would inform later imperial policies. The loss of Normandy to Philip Augustus of France in 1204 forced England to look inward and westward for expansion. The conquest of Wales proceeded gradually under Edward III, culminating in the construction of a ring of mighty castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, that still stand as monuments to medieval military engineering. Edward's attempt to conquer Scotland proved less successful, sparking a long war of independence that produced heroes like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. The 100 Years' War with France, beginning in 1337, saw English armies win stunning victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, demonstrating the effectiveness of the English longbow and the discipline of English soldiers. Though ultimately unsuccessful in its goal of securing the French throne, the war established England's reputation as a formidable military power and provided experience in overseas campaigning that would prove invaluable in later colonial ventures. The Wars of the Roses. That bloody dynastic struggle between Lancaster and York paradoxically strengthened England in the long term. The destruction of much of the old nobility cleared the way for new men and new ideas, while the eventual Tudor victory brought stability and strong central government. Henry VII's careful financial management and diplomatic skill laid the foundation for his son's more dramatic achievements. Henry VIII's break with Rome in the 1530s had profound implications for England's future imperial development. The English Reformation created a Protestant nation surrounded by Catholic enemies, fostering a siege mentality that encouraged English expansion and colonization as a matter of survival. The dissolution of the monasteries provided the crown with resources for military and naval expansion, while religious refugees from continental Europe brought new skills and knowledge to English shores. The Elizabethan age witnessed the true birth of English maritime ambition. Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 announced England's arrival as a naval power, while his raids on Spanish treasure fleets demonstrated that even mighty Spain was vulnerable to English audacity. Sir Walter Raleigh's attempts to establish colonies in North America, though ultimately unsuccessful, pioneered techniques of colonization that would later prove successful. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked England's emergence as a major naval power. The combination of superior seamanship, favorable weather, and innovative tactics allowed the smaller English fleet to scatter Philip II's invincible armada, opening the seas to English commerce and colonization. This victory demonstrated that England could successfully challenge the greatest empire of the age, inspiring confidence in future imperial ventures. As the 16th century drew to a close, England stood poised on the brink of empire. The foundations had been laid through centuries of struggle, conquest, and consolidation. A unified kingdom, a powerful navy, an adventurous merchant class, and a Protestant faith that saw expansion as a divine mission, all these elements were now in place. The stage was set for the extraordinary expansion that would transform a small island kingdom into the greatest empire the world had ever known. The dawn of the 17th century found England transformed no longer the isolated island kingdom of medieval times, but a nation with global ambitions burning in its collective heart. The Union of Crowns in 1603, when James VI of Scotland became James I of England, created the foundation for what would eventually become Great Britain, though the formal political union lay a century in the future. The Scottish king brought with him dreams of empire that matched those of his English subjects, speaking grandly of Britain's destiny to rule the waves. The Virginia Company's establishment of Jamestown in 1607 marked England's first successful permanent settlement in North America. Captain John Smith's leadership and Pocahontas's intervention with her father, Powhatan, became the stuff of legend, but the real significance lay in the colony's survival through its starving time and eventual prosperity through tobacco cultivation. John Rolfe's marriage to Pocahontas symbolized not just personal romance, but the complex cultural exchanges that would characterize English colonialism. The Virginia experiment proved that English settlements could not only survive in the New World, but prosper, providing a model for future colonial ventures. Meanwhile, the Pilgrim Fathers aboard the Mayflower made their historic voyage to the shores of Massachusetts in 1620, seeking religious freedom in the wilderness of America. The Mayflower Compact, signed in the cramped cabin of their ship, established principles of self-government that would echo through centuries of imperial administration. Plymouth Colony's survival through its first harsh winter and the assistance of Squanto and Massasoit demonstrated both English resilience and the importance of Native American cooperation in colonial success. The Massachusetts Bay Company, chartered in 1629, represented a new model of colonial enterprise, led by John Winthrop, who envisioned their settlement as a city upon a hill. The Puritan colonists brought with them not just religious fervor, but also advanced ideas about education, governance, and economic development. Harvard College, founded in 1636, became the first institution of higher learning in North America, while the New England Confederation of 1643 pioneered intercolonial cooperation. England's entry into the lucrative East Indies trade challenged the Dutch monopoly in the Spice Islands and established the foundation for future Asian empire. The East India Company, chartered by Elizabeth I in 1600, began as a modest trading venture, but gradually evolved into something unprecedented, a commercial organization with sovereign powers. Early factories at Surat, Madras, and Bombay provided footholds in the vast subcontinent of India, where Mughal emperors still ruled over hundreds of millions of subjects. The Caribbean beckoned with promises of sugar and tropical wealth. English settlements in Barbados established in 1627, and Jamaica conquered from Spain in 1655 became the cornerstones of a plantation economy that would generate enormous wealth while creating the moral contradictions that would later challenge the empire's conscience. The cultivation of sugar cane required intensive labor, leading to the tragic expansion of the Atlantic slave trade and the forced migration of millions of Africans to English colonies. Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth period, following the execution of Charles I in 1649, marked a crucial phase in imperial development. The Navigation Acts, first passed in 1651, established the principle that colonial trade should primarily benefit the mother country, creating the foundation of the mercantile system that would govern imperial commerce for 2 centuries. Cromwell's Western design, though failing in its attempt to capture Hispaniola, succeeded in taking Jamaica, adding a major Caribbean base to England's growing empire. The Lord Protector's military reforms created the new model army, a professional force that proved superior to traditional feudal levies. English victories in Ireland, Scotland, and the Caribbean demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined, ideologically motivated troops. The expansion of the Royal Navy under Commonwealth rule laid the groundwork for future naval supremacy, while Cromwell's religious tolerance attracted skilled immigrants from across Europe. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought renewed energy to colonial expansion. The King's grant of Carolina to 8 proprietors in 1663 established another North American colony, while the conquest of New Amsterdam from the Dutch in 1664 secured the vital Mid-Atlantic region. The renaming of the captured city to New York honored the King's brother, the Duke of York, whose own colonial interests would later bring him to the throne as James II. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn in 1681 as a holy experiment in religious tolerance and peaceful relations with Native Americans, represented the highest ideals of English colonialism. Penn's treaty with the Delaware Indians and his policy of fair purchase of native lands created a model of colonial indigenous relations that tragically few other colonies would follow. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, quickly became one of North America's most prosperous settlements. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670, opened the Canadian wilderness to English trade and exploration. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the King's cousin and the company's first governor, oversaw the establishment of trading posts along the shores of Hudson Bay, challenging French claims to the northern fur trade. The company's rivalry with French coureurs de bois and voyageurs added a new dimension to the growing imperial competition between England and France. King Philip's War in New England, 1675 to 1676, tested the young colony's military capabilities and revealed both the strengths and limitations of English colonial society. The war's devastating impact on both colonists and Native Americans demonstrated the violent potential inherent in colonial expansion, while the colonists' ultimate victory established English dominance throughout southern New England. Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, 1676, exposed tensions within colonial society itself, as frontier settlers rebelled against the colonial government's allegedly insufficient protection against Native American raids. Nathaniel Bacon's temporary seizure of Jamestown revealed the democratic impulses stirring within English colonial society, presaging future conflicts between imperial authority and colonial autonomy. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 brought William III and Mary II to the throne, establishing parliamentary supremacy and Protestant succession, while launching England into a generation of warfare against Louis XIV's France. The War of the League of Augsburg, 1688-1697, and the War of Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, transformed colonial competition into global conflict, with battles fought from Hudson Bay to the Caribbean, from Gibraltar to India. These conflicts accelerated imperial development By demonstrating the strategic value of overseas territories and the economic benefits of colonial trade. The capture of Gibraltar in 1704 secured English access to the Mediterranean, while the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 granted England significant territorial gains, including Acadia, renamed Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Hudson Bay Territory, along with the lucrative asiento, the contract to supply slaves to Spanish America. The Bank of England, established in 1694, provided the financial infrastructure necessary for sustained imperial expansion. The bank's ability to manage government debt and finance military operations gave England decisive advantages over rivals who lacked similar institutions. The development of marine insurance joint stock companies and sophisticated credit mechanisms created the economic foundation upon which empire would be built. By 1714, as Queen Anne's reign ended and the Hanoverian succession brought George I to the throne, England had established the basic framework of a global empire. 13 thriving colonies stretched along the North American coast, from Georgia to Maine, while Caribbean sugar islands generated unprecedented wealth. Trading posts in India offered access to the riches of Asia, while the Royal Navy increasingly commanded the sea lanes that connected these far-flung territories. The transformation was remarkable. In little more than a century, England had evolved from a European kingdom with modest overseas interests into a global power with territories on every inhabited continent. The foundations of the greatest empire in human history had been firmly established, built upon English courage, enterprise, and adaptability, but also upon the displacement of indigenous peoples and the exploitation of enslaved Africans. As the 18th century dawned, the stage was set for even greater expansion and the emergence of Britain as the world's dominant imperial power. The ascension of George I to the British throne in 1714 marked the beginning of an era that would witness the transformation of a maritime trading nation into the world's first truly global empire. The Hanoverian succession brought political stability to Britain, while continental entanglements drew the kingdom ever deeper into European affairs, creating a complex web of alliances and conflicts that would ultimately propel British power to unprecedented heights across the seven seas. The South Sea Bubble of 1720, though a financial catastrophe that ruined thousands of investors, paradoxically strengthened Britain's imperial foundations by demonstrating both the potential and the perils of overseas speculation. The collapse of the South Sea Company's grandiose schemes taught British merchants and politicians valuable lessons about sustainable colonial development, leading to more cautious but ultimately more successful approaches to imperial expansion. From the ashes of financial ruin arose a more sophisticated understanding of how to harness private enterprise for imperial purposes. Robert Walpole's long tenure as First Minister from 1721 to 1742 provided the political stability necessary for sustained imperial growth. His policy of avoiding expensive continental wars while building up Britain's naval strength and colonial trade created the foundation for future expansion. Walpole's famous declaration that he was not a saint, no Spartan, no reformer, reflected a pragmatic approach to governance that prioritized economic prosperity over ideological purity, allowing British merchants and settlers to pursue their fortunes across the globe with minimal interference from London. The War of Jenkins's Ear, beginning in 1739, demonstrated how colonial incidents could escalate into global conflicts. Captain Robert Jenkins's severed ear, allegedly cut off by Spanish coast guards, became a symbol of Spanish oppression that inflamed British public opinion and launched the nation into war. Though the conflict began over Caribbean trading rights, it soon merged with the larger War of Austrian Succession, creating a global theater of operations that stretched from the forests of North America to the coasts of India. In North America, British colonists demonstrated their military capabilities during King George's War, 1744-1748, the American phase of the War of Austrian Succession. The capture of the French fortress of Louisbourg by New England militiamen under William Pepperell proved that colonial forces could achieve significant victories against European powers. Though the fortress was returned to France at the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, the victory boosted colonial confidence and demonstrated the strategic importance of controlling key strongpoints in North America. The Ohio Company's formation in 1747 and its subsequent attempts to establish settlements in the Ohio Valley brought British and French imperial ambitions into direct conflict. The struggle for control of this strategic region, where the headwaters of rivers flowing to the Atlantic Gulf of Mexico and Great Lakes created natural highways into the continental interior, would ultimately determine which European power would dominate North America. Young George Washington's mission to warn the French away from the Ohio Valley in 1753 marked the beginning of his remarkable career and the countdown to global war. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, represented the first truly global conflict in human history, with battles fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, and the Philippines. Frederick the Great's Prussia, subsidized by British gold, held down French and Austrian armies in Europe, while British forces struck at French colonies around the world. This strategy of using continental allies to tie down enemy forces while British sea power dominated the oceans would become a hallmark of British grand strategy for the next century. General James Wolfe's dramatic victory on the Plains of Abraham in 1759, though it cost him his life, secured British control of Quebec and effectively ended French power in North America. The young general's heroic death, while reciting Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, captured the British imagination and transformed a military victory into an epic of national mythology. The conquest of New France added vast territories to the British Empire, while eliminating Britain's most dangerous rival in North America. Simultaneously, Robert Clive's extraordinary victories in India, particularly his triumph at Plassey in 1757, established British dominance over the wealthy Bengal region and marked the beginning of territorial empire in the subcontinent. Clive's defeat of Suraj-ud-Dawla, with a force of only 3,000 men against 50,000, demonstrated how superior disciplined tactics and local alliances could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The wealth of Bengal, flowing through the East India Company's coffers, would finance further expansion and make Britain the richest nation on earth. Captain James Cook's first voyage, 1768 to 1771, opened the Pacific Ocean to British exploration and colonization, adding Australia and New Zealand to the empire's potential territories. Cook's scientific approach to exploration, combining naval skill with systematic observation and mapping, epitomized the Enlightenment spirit that increasingly characterized British imperial endeavors. His encounters with indigenous peoples across the Pacific, though often leading to tragic consequences, revealed the vast diversity of human societies that would soon fall under British influence. The acquisition of the Falkland Islands in 1766, though seemingly insignificant, at the time demonstrated Britain's determination to establish strategic bases throughout the world's oceans. These remote South Atlantic islands would later prove their worth as way station for ships rounding Cape Horn, while their seizure illustrated the methodical nature of British expansion, securing every potentially useful territory regardless of immediate economic value. The Stamp Act crisis of 1765 revealed the first serious cracks in the imperial structure as American colonists violently resisted British attempts to tax them directly. The cry of no taxation without representation challenged fundamental assumptions about imperial governance and raised questions about the relationship between mother country and colonies that would ultimately prove impossible to resolve within the existing framework. The Act's repeal in 1766 only postponed the inevitable confrontation between British authority and colonial autonomy. Warren Hastings's appointment as the first Governor-General of Bengal in 1773 marked the beginning of systematic British administration in India. His reforms, though controversial, and ultimately leading to his impeachment trial, established precedents for governing vast populations of non-European subjects that would influence imperial policy worldwide. The Regulating Act of 1773, which placed the East India Company under parliamentary oversight, represented Parliament's first attempt to regulate imperial administration directly. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 crystallized American resistance to British policies and set in motion the chain of events that would lead to revolution. The destruction of 342 chests of East India Company tea demonstrated how colonial opposition had evolved from protests against specific policies to rejection of British authority itself. The Intolerable Acts. Parliament's punitive response to the Tea Party only served to unite the colonies in opposition and accelerate the march toward armed rebellion. The First Continental Congress's meeting in Philadelphia in 1774 represented a new form of intercolonial cooperation that threatened to transform 13 separate colonies into a united nation. The delegates' adoption of the Continental Association, organizing a comprehensive boycott of British goods, demonstrated sophisticated political organization and economic coordination that impressed observers on both sides of the Atlantic. The Congress's petition to King George III, while still acknowledging royal authority, asserted colonial rights in terms that made future compromise increasingly unlikely. The battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 marked the beginning of armed rebellion in Britain's most valuable colonial possession. The shot, heard round the world, launched not just the American Revolution, but a global conflict that would test every aspect of British imperial power. The surprising effectiveness of colonial militiamen against British regulars at Concord Bridge revealed that the empire faced not just political opposition, but a genuine military threat. The Second Continental Congress's decision to appoint George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army transformed a Massachusetts rebellion into an American Revolution. Washington's acceptance of command, without pay, declaring that he would keep exact accounts of his expenses, embodied the Republican virtues that would characterize American resistance to imperial authority. His leadership would prove crucial in sustaining colonial resistance through 8 years of warfare. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, represented far more than American rejection of British rule. It articulated principles of human equality and popular sovereignty that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which all European empires rested. Thomas Jefferson's stirring prose declaring that all men are created equal and possess unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, created a new standard by which imperial governance would be judged. France's entry into the war in 1778 transformed the American Rebellion into a global conflict that stretched British resources to their breaking point. The Franco-American alliance, negotiated by Benjamin Franklin's masterful diplomacy, brought French naval power into play against British sea lanes, while opening a second front in the Caribbean. Spain's subsequent entry into the war further complicated Britain's strategic position by threatening Gibraltar and Jamaica simultaneously. The Siege of Gibraltar, 1779 to 1783, became a symbol of British determination and resilience, as the garrison held out against Spanish and French forces for nearly 4 years. General George Augustus Elliot's defense of the Rock demonstrated British ability to to maintain isolated strongpoints through superior seamanship and unwavering resolve. The successful defense preserved Britain's gateway to the Mediterranean and maintained imperial prestige, even as the empire faced challenges elsewhere. Admiral George Rodney's victory at the Battle of the Saints in 1782 preserved British control of the Caribbean and prevented French invasion of Jamaica. Rodney's innovative tactics, breaking the French line and concentrating superior firepower against isolated enemy ships, demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had made the Royal Navy supreme. The victory secured Britain's sugar islands and maintained the economic foundation of imperial power, even as political control crumbled in North America. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 marked both the nadir of British imperial fortunes and the beginning of an extraordinary recovery that would see the empire reach unprecedented heights. The loss of the 13 American colonies, Britain's most populous and economically valuable overseas territories, sent shockwaves through the imperial establishment and forced a fundamental reassessment of colonial policy. Yet even as Lord North's government collapsed under the weight of military defeat, the foundations were already being laid for a new and greater imperial expansion that would more than compensate for American independence. The Loyalist exodus from the newly independent United States created both humanitarian crisis and imperial opportunity. Nearly 100,000 Americans who had remained faithful to the crown fled their homes, carrying with them not just personal possessions, but also valuable skills, capital, and unwavering commitment to British institutions. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick absorbed tens of thousands of these refugees, transforming these maritime provinces from sparsely settled frontier territories into thriving colonial societies. The Loyalists' arrival in Canada established a substantial English-speaking population alongside the French Canadians of Quebec, creating the demographic foundation for future Canadian Confederation. Captain Arthur Phillip's establishment of the first penal colony at Botany Bay in 1788 transformed Australia from an unknown southern continent into an integral part of the British Empire. The first fleet's arrival, with 736 convicts, 211 Marines, and assorted officials, marked the beginning of European settlement in a continent that had been inhabited by Aboriginal peoples for over 50,000 years. Philip's humane treatment of the convicts and his attempts to establish peaceful relations with Aboriginal peoples, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated a more enlightened approach to colonial administration than had characterized earlier imperial ventures. The Constitutional Act of 1791 divided Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada, establishing representative government and English law in the western portion, while preserving French civil law and Catholic rights in the east. This creative solution to the challenge of governing diverse populations within a single imperial framework would influence colonial policy throughout the empire. The Act's recognition of cultural and religious differences, while maintaining overall British sovereignty, became a model for imperial governance in other multi-ethnic territories. Meanwhile, in India, the impeachment trial of Warren Hastings, 1788 to 1795, riveted British attention and established important precedents for imperial accountability. Though Hastings was ultimately acquitted, the trial's proceedings, brilliantly managed by Edmund Burke, established the principle that imperial administrators could be held responsible for their actions, regardless of the vast distances that separated them from parliamentary oversight. Burke's famous declaration that the British Empire must be governed on British principles of justice articulated a moral vision of empire that would influence imperial policy for generations. Lord Cornwallis' appointment as Governor-General of India in 1786 inaugurated a new era of systematic imperial administration. His permanent settlement in Bengal, establishing fixed land revenues and property rights, created a class of Indian landlords with vested interests in British rule, while generating steady income for imperial expansion. Though the settlement's long-term consequences proved problematic, it demonstrated British determination to govern India as a permanent possession, rather than merely a commercial venture. The Third Mysore War, 1790 and 1792, established British supremacy in southern India through the defeat of Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, whose innovative military tactics and French alliance had posed a serious threat to British expansion. Cornwallis's victory at Seringapatam eliminated the last major Indian ruler capable of challenging British power, while the treaty's territorial gains extended British control throughout the Carnatic region. Tipu's eventual death in the Fourth Mysore War, 1799, removed the final obstacle to British dominance of the subcontinent. The French Revolutionary Wars, 1792 to 1802, provided Britain with new opportunities for imperial expansion, while testing the empire's resilience against unprecedented ideological and military challenges. The execution of Louis XVI sent shockwaves through Europe's monarchical establishment, while French revolutionary ideology threatened to inspire colonial rebellions throughout the European empires. Britain's emergence as the leader of successive coalitions against revolutionary France established its position as Europe's premier power, while providing justification for seizing French and Allied territories worldwide. The British occupation of Ceylon, 1796, and the Cape of Good Hope, 1795, demonstrated the strategic importance of controlling key maritime choke points in an era of global warfare. These territories, initially seized to prevent French occupation, became permanent additions to the empire due to their crucial role in protecting the sea routes to India. The Cape's position at the southern tip of Africa made it an essential way station for ships traveling to and from the East Indies, while Ceylon's harbors provided secure bases for naval operations in the Indian Ocean. Admiral Horatio Nelson's victories at the Battle of the Nile, 1798, and the Battle of Copenhagen, 1801, established British naval supremacy throughout the Mediterranean and Baltic, securing the sea lanes upon which imperial commerce depended. Nelson's innovative tactics, personal charisma, and willingness to risk everything for victory created a new model of naval leadership that inspired a generation of British officers. His destruction of the French fleet at Aboukir Bay stranded Napoleon's army in Egypt and demonstrated that British naval power could project force anywhere in the world. The Irish Rebellion of 1798 revealed the vulnerability of Britain's own home territories to revolutionary contagion and foreign invasion. The United Irishmen's attempt to establish an independent Irish Republic, supported by French military assistance, threatened to create a hostile power on Britain's doorstep that could serve as a base for future enemy operations. Though the rebellion was ultimately suppressed with considerable brutality, it convinced British leaders that the existing relationship with Ireland was unsustainable. The Act of Union 1800 merged the Irish and British parliaments, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and eliminating the constitutional anomaly of separate kingdoms under a single crown. Though the union was achieved through a combination of bribery and coercion that tainted its legitimacy from the beginning, it removed the possibility of Irish independence serving French strategic purposes, while theoretically providing Irish Catholics with representation in the imperial parliament. The Peace of Amiens, 1802, provided a brief respite from warfare, while confirming Britain's emergence as the world's dominant imperial power. Though the treaty restored most conquered territories to their original owners, Britain retained Ceylon and Trinidad, two strategically vital possessions that enhanced imperial security and economic potential. The peace's brevity demonstrated that the underlying causes of conflict between Britain and France remained unresolved, while Britain's rapid rearmament revealed the empire's growing industrial and financial strength. The resumption of war in 1803 initiated the final phase of the struggle between Britain and Napoleonic France, a conflict that would determine the future shape of the global imperial system. Napoleon's continental system, attempting to exclude British trade from European markets, paradoxically accelerated British expansion into new markets throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The emperor's efforts to strangle British commerce only demonstrated the empire's growing economic resilience and global reach. The British occupation of Buenos Aires, 1806-1807, though ultimately unsuccessful, revealed both the potential and the limitations of imperial expansion in Latin America. The expedition's initial success in capturing the Spanish colonial capital demonstrated British military capability and local dissatisfaction with Spanish rule, while its eventual failure illustrated the challenges of maintaining control over hostile populations without adequate resources or local support. The venture's ultimate legacy lay in its demonstration that Spanish colonial rule was vulnerable to external pressure and internal dissent. Nelson's final victory at Trafalgar 1805 achieved the complete destruction of Franco-Spanish naval power and secured British command of the seas for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars. The admiral's death, at the moment of triumph, struck down by a French marksman while directing the battle from HMS Victory's quarterdeck, transformed military victory into national martyrdom and established Nelson as the embodiment of British naval valor. His famous signal, "England expects that every man will do his duty," became a rallying cry that would inspire British sailors for generations to come. The continental system's failure to break British economic power revealed the empire's growing industrial dominance and commercial sophistication. British manufacturers' ability to find new markets throughout the world demonstrated the flexibility and adaptability that characterized imperial commerce, while the Royal Navy's success in maintaining global trade routes showed how naval supremacy could be converted into economic advantage. The period's rapid industrial growth provided the technological foundation for future imperial expansion, while generating the wealth necessary to sustain global military commitments. Arthur Wellesley's Peninsula Campaign, 1808-1814, demonstrated British ability to sustain major military operations on the European continent while maintaining global imperial commitments. The future Duke of Wellington's methodical campaign against French forces in Spain and Portugal revealed the tactical and logistical capabilities that would later prove crucial in imperial expansion. His victories at Salamanca, Vitoria, and numerous other engagements established his reputation as one of history's greatest generals, while proving that British forces could defeat the finest European armies. The War of 1812 with the United States tested British ability to fight simultaneously in Europe and North America while maintaining imperial commitments elsewhere. Though the conflict ultimately ended in stalemate, British forces' successful defense of Canada demonstrated the empire's capacity to protect its territories even when facing multiple enemies. The burning of Washington and the bombardment of Baltimore showed that Britain could still project power across the Atlantic, while the Battle of New Orleans reminded imperial planners that American military capabilities remained formidable. Wellington's final victory over Napoleon at Waterloo, 1815, established British hegemony over Europe and secured the empire's position as the world's dominant power. The Duke's famous declaration that the battle was a damned near-run thing understated the victory's world historical significance, which eliminated Britain's last serious European rival and cleared the path for a century of imperial expansion. The Congress of Vienna's territorial settlements, heavily influenced by British diplomacy, created a European balance of power that would endure until 1914, while confirming Britain's global supremacy. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of Europe in 1815, Britain stood triumphant, its empire intact, and its power unmatched. The long struggle against revolutionary and Napoleonic France had tested every aspect of imperial strength and found it adequate to the challenge. The Royal Navy commanded the seas. British merchants traded in every corner of the globe, and British territories stretched from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. The stage was now set for the greatest period of imperial expansion in human history, as Britain prepared to extend its dominion over a quarter of the Earth's surface and a quarter of its population. The Congress of Vienna's conclusion in 1815 ushered in an era of unprecedented British dominance that would transform the very nature of global civilization. As European powers carved up Napoleon's former empire and restored the Ancien Régime, Britain emerged not merely as the victor in a great war, but as the architect of a new world order based upon free trade, naval supremacy, and liberal institutions. The Pax Britannica was about to begin a century-long period during which British power would shape the destiny of nations and peoples across every continent. The Industrial Revolution, already transforming Britain's landscape with smoking factories and iron railways, provided the technological foundation for imperial expansion on an unprecedented scale. James Watt's steam engine, perfected in the previous century, now powered not only textile mills and coal mines, but also the steamships that would carry British influence to the remotest corners of the earth. The marriage of steam power and maritime supremacy created possibilities for global dominance that no previous empire had possessed, enabling British forces to project power rapidly across vast distances while maintaining reliable communication and supply lines. George Stephenson's rocket triumphant winner of the Rainhill Trials in 1829 demonstrated the revolutionary potential of steam locomotion. The Liverpool-Manchester Railway's opening in 1830, though marred by the tragic death of William Huskisson, the first railway fatality, inaugurated an age of rapid transportation that would bind the empire together with iron bonds. Within decades, railways would stretch across India, Canada, Australia, and Africa, carrying British administrators, soldiers, and settlers, while extracting the wealth of continents for transport to London's markets. The Reform Act of 1832 extended political participation to Britain's growing middle classes, creating a domestic consensus for imperial expansion that would endure throughout the Victorian era. The Act's redistribution of parliamentary seats from rotten boroughs to industrial cities reflected the economic transformation that was making Britain the workshop of the world. This new industrial bourgeoisie, enriched by global trade and domestic manufacturing, provided both the political support and financial resources necessary for sustained imperial expansion. The abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833 marked a watershed moment in imperial history, demonstrating how moral conviction could reshape global institutions. William Wilberforce's long campaign, finally achieving victory shortly before his death, eliminated the most morally objectionable aspect of imperial rule, while paradoxically strengthening Britain's position as the world's moral leader. The compensation paid to slave owners, amounting to $20 million, equivalent to billions in today's currency, represented the largest government expenditure in British history to that date, demonstrating the nation's commitment to its evolving imperial mission. The abolition of slavery created both opportunities and challenges for imperial administrators. In the Caribbean, the transition from slave to free labor required new systems of labor management, leading to the importation of indentured workers from India and China. These new forms of bound labor, while technically free, created complex patterns of migration and cultural exchange that would reshape colonial societies throughout the empire. The Indian coolies, working Trinidadian sugar estates, and Chinese laborers building Canadian railways became part of the empire's increasingly diverse population. Captain Charles Darwin's voyage aboard HMS Beagle, 1831 to 1836, exemplified the scientific spirit that increasingly characterized British imperial ventures. Darwin's observations in the Galapagos Islands would revolutionize humanity's understanding of itself, while his detailed studies of coral reef formation and geological processes demonstrated the practical benefits of scientific exploration. The Beagle's mission, combining hydrographic surveying with natural history research, illustrated how imperial expansion could advance human knowledge while serving strategic and commercial purposes. The First Afghan War, 1839 to 1842, provided a harsh lesson in the limits of imperial power even at its height. The British invasion of Afghanistan, ostensibly to prevent Russian influence in Central Asia, achieved initial success with the capture of Kabul and the installation of Shah Shuja as puppet ruler. However, the subsequent insurgency and the catastrophic retreat from Kabul, in which only Dr. William Brydon survived from an army of 4,500 British and Indian troops, demonstrated that imperial power had boundaries even in an age of technological supremacy. The disaster at Gandamak, where the last remnants of the British force made their final stand, became a symbol of imperial hubris and Afghan resistance that would echo through subsequent conflicts. The massacre of the retreating army, including women and children of the garrison, shocked British public opinion and forced a reassessment of imperial strategy in Central Asia. The eventual British withdrawal, though disguised by face-saving expeditions, marked the first major imperial defeat of the Victorian era. The Opium Wars with China, 1839 to 1842, 1856 to 1860, revealed both the moral contradictions and overwhelming power of British imperialism. The First Opium War, triggered by Chinese attempts to suppress the opium trade that was devastating their population, demonstrated how commercial interests could drive imperial policy into morally indefensible positions. Commissioner Lin Zexu's destruction of opium stocks in Canton and his appeals to Queen Victoria's conscience fell on deaf ears as British merchants and officials prioritized profit over Chinese welfare. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, ending the First Opium War, established the template for unequal treaties that would characterize Western relations with East Asia for the next century. Hong Kong's cession to Britain created a permanent base for British operations in Chinese waters, while the opening of 5 treaty ports and the imposition of extraterritoriality demonstrated Chinese weakness and Western technological superiority. The indemnity of $21 million paid by China not only compensated British merchants for their destroyed opium, but also financed further imperial expansion. The Great Irish Famine, 1845 to 1852, tested the empire's capacity for humanitarian response while revealing the brutal realities of imperial economics. The potato blight that devastated Ireland's primary food crop exposed the vulnerability of populations dependent on single crops, while the British government's inadequate response demonstrated how ideological commitment to free market principles could override humanitarian concerns. The death of over 1 million Irish people and the emigration of another million fundamentally altered the demographic balance of the British Isles while fueling Irish nationalism for generations to come. The famine's impact extended far beyond Ireland, as Irish emigrants carried their resentment of British rule to America, Australia, and other destinations throughout the empire. These Irish diaspora communities would provide financial and political support for Irish independence movements, while also contributing their labor and skills to imperial development. The contradiction between Irish suffering under British rule and Irish participation in British imperial expansion created tensions that would influence imperial policy well into the 20th century. Sir James Brooke's establishment of personal rule in Sarawak, 1841, exemplified the entrepreneurial spirit that characterized Victorian expansion. Brooke's suppression of piracy and his benevolent administration of Dayak and Malay populations demonstrated how individual initiative could extend British influence without formal government involvement. His appointment as Raja of Sarawak by the Sultan of Brunei created a unique form of personal empire that would endure for over a century while serving British strategic interests in Southeast Asia. The acquisition of Natal 1843 and the Orange River Sovereignty 1848 extended British control throughout southern Africa while creating new sources of conflict with Boer settlers and African kingdoms. The Great Trek's participants seeking to escape British rule and its restrictions on slavery and racial policies found themselves once again under British authority as imperial boundaries expanded. The discovery of diamonds at Kimberley, 1867, and gold on the Witwatersrand, 1886, would transform these territorial acquisitions into sources of unprecedented mineral wealth. The Sikh Wars, 1845 to 1846, 1848 to 1849, eliminated the last major Indian power capable of challenging British supremacy while demonstrating the military effectiveness of the East India Company's armies. The battles of Mud Ki Firoza Shah and Sobraon showcased British artillery, superiority, and disciplined infantry formations, while the annexation of the Punjab added some of India's most fertile agricultural land to the company's territories. The incorporation of Sikh regiments into the company's army provided some of the empire's finest soldiers whose loyalty would prove crucial during the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The Second Sikh War's conclusion, with the annexation of the entire Punjab, marked the completion of British territorial conquest in India. Governor-General Lord Dalhousie's policy of annexing states whose rulers died without male heirs, known as the Doctrine of Lapse, eliminated remaining independent principalities while generating resentment among dispossessed ruling families. The annexation of Oudh in 1856, justified by allegations of misgovernment, removed the last major indigenous state and completed the transformation of the Indian subcontinent into a British possession. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in Joseph Paxton's revolutionary Crystal Palace, celebrated British industrial supremacy while showcasing the empire's global reach. The exhibition's display of raw materials from every corner of the empire alongside finished goods produced in British factories illustrated the complementary relationship between imperial territories and the metropolitan economy. The 6 million visitors who marveled at exhibits ranging from the Koh-i-Noor diamond to Australian wool witnessed the material foundation of British global dominance. Prince Albert's vision of the exhibition as a celebration of human progress and international cooperation reflected the optimistic spirit of mid-Victorian Britain. The profits from the exhibition, used to establish the Victoria and Albert Museum and other educational institutions in South Kensington, demonstrated how imperial wealth could be transformed into cultural and intellectual capital. The Crystal Palace itself, relocated to Sydenham after the exhibition's close, became a symbol of the age's faith in progress and technology. Lord Palmerston's gunboat diplomacy exemplified the confident assertion of British interests throughout the world. His defense of Don Pacifico, a Portuguese Jew with British citizenship whose house was attacked by an Athens mob, led to a naval blockade of Greece, and the famous declaration that British citizenship should provide the same protection anywhere in the world as Roman citizenship had provided in ancient times. This Civis Britannicus, some speech, articulated a vision of imperial citizenship that transcended national boundaries while asserting British responsibility for protecting its subjects worldwide. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of British military organization, while demonstrating the empire's capacity for sustained warfare against a major European power. The Light Brigade's charge at Balaclava, immortalized in Tennyson's poem, became a symbol of heroic futility that captured the war's mixture of courage and incompetence. Florence Nightingale's nursing reforms and Mary Seacole's medical work among wounded soldiers pioneered modern military medicine while highlighting the role of women in imperial service. The war's conclusion with the Treaty of Paris established important precedents for international law while confirming British naval supremacy in the Black Sea. The neutralization of the Black Sea and the guarantee of Ottoman territorial integrity served British interests by limiting Russian expansion while maintaining the Eastern Question as a source of European tension that Britain could exploit. The war's cost in lives and money, though substantial, demonstrated the empire's financial resilience and military reach. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 erupted like a thunderclap across the subcontinent, challenging the very foundations of British rule and forcing the empire to confront the contradictions inherent in governing hundreds of millions of unwilling subjects. The spark that ignited this conflagration was seemingly trivial rumors that new Enfield rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim sepoys who had to bite them to load their weapons. Yet beneath this immediate provocation lay deeper grievances. The doctrine of lapse had dispossessed traditional rulers, Christian missionaries threatened ancient religions, and the pace of Western innovation had disrupted age-old social structures. The rebellion began at Meerut on May 10, 1857, when sepoys shot their British officers and marched on Delhi proclaiming the aged Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as their leader. Within weeks, the uprising had spread across northern India, with British authority collapsing in vast territories that had been considered secure for generations. The sieges of Kanpur and Lucknow became epic struggles that would sear themselves into imperial memory, while the massacre of British civilians at Kanpur shocked the Victorian public and hardened attitudes toward imperial rule. General Henry Havelock's relief of Lucknow demonstrated both British military resilience and the empire's capacity for moral complexity during crisis. Havelock, a devout Baptist who distributed religious tracts alongside military orders, led his small force across hostile territory with remarkable success, winning battle after battle against overwhelming odds. His death from dysentery just days after entering Lucknow transformed him into a Christian martyr for the imperial cause, while his tactical innovations influenced British military doctrine for decades to come. Sir Colin Campbell's final relief of Lucknow and the subsequent pacification campaign revealed the brutal realities that lay beneath the empire's civilizing mission. The systematic destruction of Delhi, the hanging of rebels from trees throughout the countryside, and the infamous Devil's Wind of retribution that swept across northern India demonstrated how quickly imperial benevolence could transform into savage vengeance. The rebellion's suppression required nearly 2 years and fundamentally altered the nature of British rule in India. The Government of India Act of 1858 transferred authority from the East India Company to the Crown, marking the end of commercial empire and the beginning of formal imperial administration. Queen Victoria's proclamation, promising religious tolerance and respect for Indian customs, attempted to address the grievances that had sparked rebellion, while the creation of the India Office in London established direct parliamentary oversight of imperial policy. The appointment of a viceroy to represent the crown in India symbolized the transformation of commercial territory into imperial dominion. The construction of the Suez Canal, 1859 to 1869, revolutionized imperial communications and strategic planning by cutting the journey time to India by weeks. Ferdinand de Lesseps's engineering marvel, though built by French enterprise, served British interests more than any other nation's, as Britain's Indian trade dominated the canal's traffic from its opening. Benjamin Disraeli's purchase of Khedive Ismail's shares in 1875 gave Britain effective control over this vital waterway, while demonstrating the empire's financial power and strategic foresight. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, tested British diplomatic skills while revealing the empire's economic dependence on global trade networks. The cotton famine that devastated Lancashire's textile industry demonstrated how imperial prosperity depended on raw materials from beyond the empire's borders, while British sympathy for the Confederacy reflected both economic interests and aristocratic disdain for American democracy. The Trent Affair, in which the Royal Navy nearly went to war over the seizure of Confederate diplomats from a British ship, showed how easily commercial disputes could escalate into international crises. The Second Opium War's conclusion, with the Treaty of Tientsin 1858 and the Convention of Peking 1860, further expanded British influence in China while highlighting the moral bankruptcy of imperial drug policy. The burning of the Summer Palace by British and French forces ordered by Lord Elgin in retaliation for Chinese torture of prisoners demonstrated the capacity for cultural destruction that accompanied imperial expansion. The legalization of opium imports and the opening of additional treaty ports served British commercial interests while accelerating China's social and economic collapse. The Maori Wars in New Zealand, 1845 to 1872, revealed the complexities of colonization in territories where indigenous peoples possessed sophisticated military capabilities and legal concepts. The Treaty of Waitangi, 1840, had promised Maori sovereignty over their lands, while establishing British government, creating contradictions that inevitably led to conflict. Governor George Grey's policies of land confiscation and cultural suppression aimed to break Maori resistance while creating settler dominance, but the war's length and cost demonstrated that imperial conquest was neither easy nor inevitable. The discovery of gold in Victoria, 1851, and New South Wales transformed Australia from a collection of struggling penal colonies into a prosperous confederation of settlements, attracting free immigrants from around the world. The gold rushes brought Chinese miners, European adventurers, and American prospectors to the Australian colonies, creating a cosmopolitan society that challenged traditional imperial racial hierarchies. The Eureka Stockade Rebellion, 1854, though quickly suppressed, demonstrated that democratic ideals could flourish even in imperial territories far from Westminster. The British North America Act 1867 created the Dominion of Canada, establishing a new model of imperial governance that balanced local autonomy with imperial unity. The Confederation of Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick under a federal system demonstrated how diverse populations could be united under British institutions while maintaining their distinct identities. Sir John A. Macdonald's vision of a transcontinental dominion connected by railway would inspire similar federal solutions throughout the empire. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, 1885, fulfilled the promise made to British Columbia upon its entry into Confederation, while demonstrating the empire's capacity for monumental engineering projects. The railway's construction through the Rocky Mountains required innovative techniques and enormous financial resources, while the employment of Chinese workers highlighted the empire's reliance on global labor migration. The driving of the last spike at Craigellachie symbolized not just the completion of a railroad, but the creation of a transcontinental nation. The opening of the telegraph cable, 1866, finally provided reliable communication between Britain and its North American territories, reducing message transmission time from weeks to hours. The successful laying of the Atlantic cable, after numerous earlier failures, represented a triumph of Victorian engineering and imperial ambition. Cyrus Field's persistence and British financial backing created the first instant global communication network, allowing London to coordinate imperial policy across vast distances. The Second Afghan War, 1878 to 1880, attempted to establish British influence in Afghanistan through a more subtle approach than the disastrous First Intervention. The Treaty of Gandamak gave Britain control over Afghan foreign policy while respecting internal autonomy, creating a buffer state against Russian expansion in Central Asia. However, the murder of the British resident Sir Louis Cavagnari and the subsequent military campaign demonstrated that imperial influence could not be maintained without local consent. The Battle of Maiwand, 1880, provided another reminder of Afghan military capabilities when Ayub Khan's forces overwhelmed a British Indian brigade, killing nearly 1,000 soldiers, including the popular General Burrows. The heroic stand of the 66th Berkshire Regiment and the famous rescue of wounded by Bobby the regimental dog became part of imperial folklore. The subsequent British withdrawal from Afghanistan, disguised as strategic redeployment, marked another failure of imperial control in the region. The Anglo-Zulu War, 1879, demonstrated how imperial expansion could be driven by local officials acting beyond their authority. Sir Bartle Frere's ultimatum to King Cetshwayo was designed to be unacceptable, providing justification for war against the Zulu kingdom. The shocking defeat at Isandlwana, where 20,000 Zulu warriors overwhelmed 700 British and colonial troops, sent shockwaves through the empire and shattered assumptions about European military superiority. The heroic defense of Rorke's Drift, where 150 British soldiers held off 4,000 Zulu warriors, restored some imperial prestige while demonstrating the courage of ordinary soldiers in desperate circumstances. The battle's 11 Victoria Crosses, the highest number ever awarded for a single action, reflected both the severity of the fighting and the empire's need for heroes to offset the Isandlwana disaster. The ultimate British victory at Ulundi eliminated Zulu military power, but at enormous cost in lives and imperial credibility. The First Boer War, 1880 to 1881, revealed growing tensions within the empire between British imperial policy and settler aspirations for independence. The Transvaal's rebellion against British annexation culminated in the defeat at Majuba Hill, where General Sir George Colley died, leading a futile assault against Boer positions. The subsequent Pretoria Convention restored Transvaal independence under British suzerainty, creating an ambiguous arrangement that satisfied neither side and ensured future conflict. The occupation of Egypt, 1882, transformed a temporary intervention into permanent imperial responsibility, adding the Nile Valley to Britain's global territories. The bombardment of Alexandria and the victory at Tel el-Kebir eliminated Egyptian independence, while ostensibly supporting the Khedive against nationalist rebels. Sir Garnet Wolseley's rapid campaign demonstrated improved imperial military efficiency, while the appointment of Evelyn Baring, later Lord Cromer as Consul General, established the veiled protectorate that would govern Egypt for the next 4 decades. General Gordon's death at Khartoum, 1885, created one of the Victorian era's most powerful imperial martyrs, while demonstrating the limits of imperial responsibility in distant territories. Gordon's mission to evacuate Egyptian forces from the Sudan had exceeded its original scope, as the charismatic general attempted to defeat the Mahdi's Islamic Revolution. His death, just 2 days before the relief expedition arrived, sparked public outrage against Gladstone's government, while establishing Gordon as a symbol of imperial sacrifice and Christian heroism. The scramble for Africa accelerated during the 1880s as European powers competed for territories and resources across the continent. The Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, established rules for African partition while recognizing effective occupation as the basis for territorial claims. Britain's strategy focused on controlling key strategic points and river systems rather than vast territorial blocks, leading to the acquisition of protectorates and spheres of influence from West Africa to the Indian Ocean. Cecil Rhodes's expansion into Central Africa exemplified the role of private enterprise in imperial expansion. The British South Africa Company's acquisition of mining rights and administrative authority in what became southern and northern Rhodesia demonstrated how commercial interests could drive territorial acquisition. Rhodes's vision of a Cape to Cairo railway connecting British territories from south to north captured the imperial imagination while serving his personal commercial interests and imperial strategic goals. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901 marked more than the passing of a beloved monarch. It signaled the end of an era of unprecedented British dominance and the beginning of a new century that would test the empire's resilience against challenges, both internal and external. The old Queen's 63-year reign had witnessed the transformation of Britain from a European kingdom into a global empire upon which the sun never set, encompassing a quarter of the world's land surface and governing nearly 400 million subjects. Yet even as Edward VII ascended the throne, the foundations of imperial supremacy were already showing signs of strain. The Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, had revealed disturbing weaknesses in British military organization and imperial solidarity that would have profound consequences for the empire's future. What began as a confident march to Pretoria became a prolonged guerrilla conflict that exposed the limits of conventional military power against determined popular resistance. The sieges of Mafeking, Kimberley, and Ladysmith captured global attention, while Lord Roberts's eventual victory came at a cost that shocked imperial public opinion and foreign observers alike. The war's concentration camps, established by Lord Kitchener to isolate Boer civilians from guerrilla fighters, created international scandal and moral controversy that tainted Britain's reputation as a civilizing force. Emily Hobhouse's investigations revealed conditions that resulted in the deaths of over 26,000 Boer women and children, while similar camps for Black Africans received even less attention despite comparable mortality rates. The Liberal opposition's criticism of conservative war policy demonstrated growing domestic divisions over imperial methods and objectives. The Treaty of Vereeniging, 1902, ended the conflict through generous terms that recognized Afrikaner cultural rights, while incorporating the former republics into the British Empire. The promise of eventual self-government and the payment of $3 million in compensation reflected a new approach to imperial governance that emphasized conciliation over coercion. However, the treaty's silence on Black African political rights stored up future troubles while demonstrating the empire's willingness to sacrifice humanitarian principles for white settler solidarity. The Entente Cordiale with France, 1904, marked a revolutionary shift in British foreign policy, ending centuries of Anglo-French rivalry and creating a new diplomatic alignment that would reshape global politics. Edward VII's state visit to Paris and the subsequent resolution of colonial disputes from Newfoundland to Siam demonstrated how imperial competition could be transformed into cooperation against new threats. The agreement's implicit anti-German orientation reflected growing concerns about the Reich's naval expansion and continental ambitions. The Anglo-Russian Convention, 1907, completed Britain's diplomatic revolution by resolving imperial tensions from the Balkans to Central Asia. The agreement partitioned Persia into spheres of influence, guaranteed Afghanistan's independence under British guidance, and recognized Russian interests in northern Persia while protecting British control over the Persian Gulf. This settlement of the Great Game allowed both empires to focus on the growing German threat while maintaining their Asian interests through cooperation rather than competition. The liberal landslide of 1906 brought to power a government committed to social reform and imperial responsibility, yet paradoxically presided over some of the empire's most controversial episodes. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman's condemnation of conservative war methods as methods of barbarism during the Boer War had established liberal credentials as champions of humanitarian imperialism. However, the realities of governing a global empire would force liberal ministers to compromise their ideals in ways that would test party unity and imperial credibility. The Denshawi incident, 1906 in Egypt, demonstrated how minor colonial episodes could escalate into major international controversies. The shooting of British officers during a pigeon hunting expedition led to trials and executions that outraged Egyptian opinion and embarrassed the liberal government. The incident revealed the fragility of imperial authority when based primarily on force rather than consent, while Egyptian nationalist reactions foreshadowed future challenges to British rule throughout the empire. The constitutional crisis in South Africa, culminating in the Union of South Africa Act 1909, established a new model of imperial federation while entrenching racial segregation that would plague the region for generations. The compromise between British imperial interests and Afrikaner nationalism created a self-governing dominion with its own military forces and internal autonomy, yet the exclusion of black Africans from political participation violated the humanitarian principles that supposedly justified imperial rule. The Imperial Conference of 1907 formalized the principle of dominion autonomy while maintaining imperial unity through consultation and cooperation. Sir Wilfrid Laurier's insistence on Canadian autonomy and Alfred Deakin's advocacy of Australian independence within the empire reflected growing colonial confidence and national consciousness. The conference's recognition of dominion equality in status, though not yet in practice, established precedents that would ultimately transform the empire into a commonwealth of nations. The Anglo-German naval race reached its climax with the launch of HMS Dreadnought, 1906, a revolutionary battleship that rendered all previous warships obsolete while sparking an arms race that neither nation could afford. Admiral Sir John Fisher's radical reforms modernized the Royal Navy's technology and organization, yet Germany's response with its own dreadnought program threatened British naval supremacy for the first time since Trafalgar. The spiraling costs of naval competition diverted resources from social reform while increasing international tensions. The Agadir Crisis, 1911, brought Europe to the brink of war, while demonstrating the empire's commitment to supporting France against German pressure. Lloyd George's Mansion House speech, declaring that Britain could not be treated as if she were of no account in the cabinet of nations, marked the liberal government's abandonment of splendid isolation and acceptance of continental commitments. The crisis's resolution through diplomatic negotiation concealed underlying tensions that would explode 3 years later. The Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913, revealed the instability of the Ottoman Empire, while creating new opportunities and challenges for British imperial policy. The Young Turk Revolution had promised reform and modernization, yet the empire's continued decline threatened British interests from Egypt to India. The emergence of independent Balkan states reduced Ottoman territory while creating new sources of international tension that would ultimately trigger global conflict. The Irish Home Rule Crisis, 1912 to 1914, brought the United Kingdom itself to the brink of civil war, while revealing fundamental contradictions in imperial governance. The Ulster Unionist Council's resistance to Irish self-government, supported by conservative opposition to the Liberal government, created a precedent for armed resistance to parliamentary decisions that would influence imperial policy worldwide. The Curragh Mutiny demonstrated that the British Army itself might not remain loyal to elected government if ordered to coerce Ulster Unionists. The Great War's outbreak in August 1914 transformed a European conflict into a global struggle that would test every aspect of imperial strength and unity. The Empire's automatic entry into war following Britain's declaration demonstrated the limits of Dominion autonomy, yet the enthusiastic response from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa proved the emotional bonds that still united the imperial family. India's contribution of 1.3 million volunteers and the colony's provision of raw materials and military bases demonstrated the empire's global reach and resources. The Gallipoli Campaign, 1915, became one of the war's most controversial episodes while forging national consciousness in Australia and New Zealand through shared sacrifice. Winston Churchill's strategic vision of opening a second front against Germany through Ottoman territory was sound in principle, yet poor planning and execution led to disaster. The Anzac landings at dawn on April 25th began 8 months of futile fighting that cost 250,000 casualties while failing to achieve any strategic objectives. The battle's legacy transcended military failure to become a founding myth for Australian and New Zealand national identity. The courage of Australian and New Zealand troops at Gallipoli, their mateship under fire, and their sacrifice for imperial causes created a complex relationship with Britain that combined pride in imperial service with growing national assertiveness. Anzac Day's annual commemoration would remind future generations of both imperial loyalty and national sacrifice. The Arab Revolt, 1916 to 1918, represented a new approach to imperial expansion through support for indigenous nationalism against rival empires. T.E. Lawrence's liaison with Arab leaders, particularly Emir Faisal, demonstrated how British intelligence and military expertise could support local independence movements while serving imperial strategic interests. The revolt's success in tying down Ottoman forces and disrupting enemy communications proved the effectiveness of unconventional warfare when properly coordinated. However, the Sykes-Picot Agreement's secret provisions for post-war partition of Ottoman territories contradicted promises made to Arab leaders and created lasting resentment against British duplicity. The agreement's division of the Middle East into British and French spheres of influence ignored Arab aspirations for independence while serving European imperial interests. The contradictions between wartime promises and post-war realities would generate conflicts that would challenge imperial authority for decades to come. The Balfour Declaration, 1917, committed Britain to supporting the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while protecting the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. This carefully worded document reflected competing pressures from Zionist lobbying, strategic considerations about post-war Middle Eastern arrangements, and genuine sympathy for Jewish aspirations following centuries of persecution. Yet the declaration's ambiguous language stored up future troubles by making contradictory promises to different communities. The Easter Rising 1916 in Dublin shocked British opinion while demonstrating the persistence of Irish nationalism. Despite apparent imperial integration, the rebels' proclamation of an Irish Republic and their use of German weapons to fight British forces during wartime seemed like treasonous collaboration with the enemy. The execution of the rebellion's leaders, however, transformed them from traitors into martyrs while radicalizing Irish opinion against British rule. The Russian Revolution 1917 eliminated one of Britain's major allies, while creating new opportunities and challenges for imperial policy. The Bolsheviks' separate peace with Germany freed enemy forces for the Western Front, yet their revolutionary ideology threatened imperial stability worldwide. The intervention in the Russian Civil War demonstrated imperial overstretch while failing to achieve its objectives, yet the containment of Bolshevism became a major imperial priority that would influence policy for decades to come. The armistice of November 11, 1918, ended 4 years of unprecedented carnage, while leaving the British Empire victorious yet fundamentally transformed. The war's cost in blood and treasure had been staggering. Nearly 1 million British and imperial dead, national debt multiplied tenfold, and social structures altered beyond recognition. Yet Britain emerged from the conflict as the world's dominant power. Its empire expanded by League of Nations mandates in the Middle East and Africa, its navy supreme on every ocean, and its influence extending to every corner of the globe. The Paris Peace Conference 1919 saw David Lloyd George maneuver skillfully between American idealism and French revanchism to secure British imperial interests. The Prime Minister's pragmatic approach balanced Wilson's 14 points against Clemenceau's demands for German punishment, while ensuring that British acquisitions of German colonies and Ottoman territories were legitimized through the mandate system. The creation of Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan as British mandates expanded imperial responsibilities while providing control over vital oil resources and strategic communications. The mandate system's idealistic language about preparing territories for self-government concealed traditional imperial expansion behind humanitarian rhetoric. Britain's administration of former German colonies in Africa and former Ottoman provinces in the Middle East demonstrated the empire's adaptability in finding new justifications for territorial acquisition. Yet the mandate's theoretical accountability to the League of Nations established precedents for international oversight of imperial administration that would prove troublesome in future decades. The Government of India Act 1919 introduced the principle of diarchy, sharing power between British officials and elected Indian politicians while maintaining ultimate imperial control. Edwin Montagu's reforms, though limited in scope, recognized the impossibility of governing 300 million Indians without their consent, while preserving British strategic and economic interests. The Act's promise of progressive realization of responsible government established a framework for gradual decolonization that would influence imperial policy throughout the interwar period. However, the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, 1919, demonstrated the gap between reformist rhetoric and imperial reality. General Reginald Dyer's order to fire on an unarmed crowd in Amritsar, killing 379 people and wounding over 1,200, shocked Indian opinion and discredited moderate nationalism. The general's defense of his actions as necessary to maintain imperial prestige revealed the authoritarian mindset that still dominated imperial administration, while the British public's mixed reaction to his punishment exposed deep divisions about imperial methods. Mahatma Gandhi's emergence as the leader of Indian nationalism transformed the independence struggle through his philosophy of satyagraha, or non-violent resistance. The Mahatma's ability to mobilize mass support across religious and regional divisions posed an unprecedented challenge to imperial authority. His campaigns of civil disobedience, from the Salt March to the boycott of British goods, demonstrated how moral authority could undermine political power while exposing the ethical contradictions of imperial rule. The non-cooperation movement, 1920 to 1922, revealed both the potential and limitations of Gandhi's methods. The campaign's success in uniting diverse Indian communities against British rule demonstrated the growing strength of nationalism, while its suspension following the Chauri Chara incident showed Gandhi's commitment to nonviolence, even when faced with imperial intransigence. The movement's failure to achieve immediate independence illustrated the difficulty of dislodging determined imperial authority through moral pressure alone. The Irish War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, brought guerrilla warfare to the British Isles themselves. forcing the government to confront armed resistance within the United Kingdom. Michael Collins's innovative tactics, combining intelligence warfare with targeted assassination, created a new model of anti-imperial struggle that would influence liberation movements worldwide. The Black and Tans' brutal counterinsurgency methods damaged Britain's reputation, while failing to crush Irish resistance, demonstrating the limits of coercive power against popular nationalism. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, 1921, partitioned Ireland, while granting Dominion status to the Irish Free State, creating a precedent for negotiated independence that would influence decolonization throughout the empire. The treaty's acceptance by the Irish Parliament, though by a narrow margin, demonstrated that imperial authority could be transferred peacefully when circumstances demanded compromise. However, the partition's creation of Northern Ireland as a separate entity within the United Kingdom stored up future troubles while satisfying neither Irish nationalists nor Ulster Unionists. The Washington Naval Conference, 1921 to 1922, marked the end of British naval supremacy and the beginning of strategic parity with the United States. The Five Power Treaty's establishment of capital ship ratios 5-5-3 for Britain, America, and Japan reflected the financial impossibility of maintaining the two-power standard against both American industrial capacity and Japanese expansion. The Anglo-Japanese alliance's termination, demanded by the United States, and the Dominions eliminated Britain's most important Pacific partnership, while failing to provide adequate alternative security arrangements. The China Crisis, 1922, revealed growing Dominion independence when Canada and South Africa refused to support British threats of war against Turkey. The crisis marked the end of automatic Dominion support for British foreign policy, while demonstrating the empire's transformation from a unitary structure into a loose association of sovereign states. Lloyd George's fall from power partly resulted from his mishandling of imperial consultation, while the crisis established precedents for Dominion autonomy that would reshape imperial governance. The Balfour Declaration of 1926, issued by the Imperial Conference, formally recognized dominions as autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, in no way subordinate one to another in any aspect of their domestic or external affairs. This constitutional revolution, achieved without violence or formal negotiation, demonstrated the empire's capacity for peaceful evolution while maintaining emotional and practical bonds between member states. The Declaration's recognition of equality while preserving unity offered a model for managing diversity within political association. The General Strike, 1926, tested British domestic stability while revealing the limits of working-class power against determined government resistance. The strike's failure, despite widespread support from miners' railway workers and other unions, demonstrated that revolutionary change was unlikely in Britain, while confirming the establishment's ability to maintain order through a combination of middle-class volunteers and military preparation. Stanley Baldwin's government's victory strengthened conservative confidence while moderating labor militancy for the remainder of the decade. The discovery of oil in the Middle East transformed British imperial strategy while creating new sources of international tension. The development of Iraqi and Persian oil fields provided the Royal Navy with secure fuel supplies while generating revenues that helped finance imperial administration. However, growing American involvement in Middle Eastern oil, combined with rising Arab nationalism, challenged British control over these vital resources. The creation of the Iraq Petroleum Company demonstrated how British, American, and French interests could cooperate in exploiting colonial resources. The Wall Street crash, 1929, and subsequent Great Depression tested imperial economic integration while revealing the empire's vulnerability to global financial instability. The collapse of commodity prices devastated colonial economies dependent on raw material exports, while declining British demand for imperial products created unemployment and social unrest throughout the empire. The Imperial Economic Conference at Ottawa, 1932, attempted to create an imperial trading bloc through preferential tariffs, yet failed to insulate the empire from global economic forces. The rise of totalitarianism in Europe and Asia posed new challenges to imperial security, while forcing Britain to choose between imperial commitments and European responsibilities. Adolf Hitler's rearmament of Germany and Benito Mussolini's expansion in Africa threatened the European balance of power, while Japan's invasion of Manchuria, 1931, challenged imperial interests in the Far East. The empire's global commitments made it impossible to concentrate sufficient force against any single threat, creating strategic vulnerabilities that would prove fatal in the next decade. The Government of India, Act 1935, granted provincial autonomy while maintaining British control over defense and foreign policy, representing the most significant constitutional reform in imperial history. The Act's complex federal structure attempted to balance Indian demands for self-government with British strategic requirements, yet satisfied neither nationalists nor imperial diehards. The Congress Party's participation in provincial governments demonstrated the possibility of gradual power transfer, while Muslim League concerns about Hindu domination foreshadowed future partition. The Abdication Crisis, 1936, revealed the monarchy's continuing importance to imperial unity, while demonstrating how personal decisions could threaten constitutional stability. Edward VIII's determination to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, created unprecedented tensions between royal prerogative and ministerial responsibility. Stanley Baldwin's skillful management of the crisis preserved monarchical dignity while establishing clear limits on royal independence, yet the king's abdication damaged imperial prestige and raised questions about the institution's future relevance. The Peel Commission's partition proposal for Palestine, 1937, attempted to resolve the irreconcilable conflict between Jewish and Arab nationalism through territorial division. The Commission's conclusion that the mandate's original objectives were impossible to achieve reflected the growing recognition that imperial promises to incompatible communities could not be fulfilled simultaneously. The proposal's rejection by both sides demonstrated the intractability of conflicts created by imperial policies, while British attempts to limit Jewish immigration during the Holocaust exposed the moral bankruptcy of appeasing Arab nationalism at Jewish expense. The Munich Agreement, 1938, represented the nadir of British appeasement, while revealing the empire's unwillingness to risk war over Central European territories. Neville Chamberlain's sacrifice of Czechoslovak independence to preserve European peace reflected both genuine desire to avoid another devastating war and realistic assessment of imperial overstretch. However, the agreement's failure to satisfy Hitler's ambitions demonstrated the futility of appeasing aggressive totalitarianism, while the guarantee to Poland committed Britain to war under even less favorable circumstances. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 found the empire more united than in 1914, yet facing enemies far more dangerous than Imperial Germany had ever been. The Dominion's individual declarations of war following their own parliamentary procedures demonstrated constitutional evolution, while confirming emotional bonds that transcended legal obligations. Canada's week-long delay, South Africa's narrow parliamentary majority, and Australia's immediate support reflected different national perspectives on imperial obligations and local interests. The fall of France, 1940, left Britain and the Empire standing alone against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, creating the Empire's greatest crisis since the American Revolution. Winston Churchill's emergence as Prime Minister and his inspiring rhetoric restored British confidence while rallying Imperial and American support for continued resistance. His famous declaration that "we shall never surrender" and promised to fight on from the empire. If Britain fell, demonstrated how imperial resources could sustain resistance even against overwhelming odds. The Battle of Britain, 1940, saved the imperial homeland while demonstrating the crucial importance of technological innovation and imperial cooperation in modern warfare. The Royal Air Force's victory over the Luftwaffe relied not only on British pilots, but also on airmen from throughout the empire and occupied Europe. The contributions of Polish, Czech, Commonwealth, and other allied pilots illustrated how the empire had become part of a broader coalition fighting for democratic values against totalitarian oppression. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 not only ended the Second World War, but also ushered in a new era that would witness the gradual dissolution of the greatest empire in human history. As Britain emerged victorious from 6 years of total warfare, the empire appeared stronger than ever, stretching from Hong Kong to Gibraltar, from India to Canada. Yet beneath the surface of triumph, the forces that would ultimately destroy imperial authority were already stirring, unleashed by the very conflict that had seemed to demonstrate British resilience and imperial unity. The war's enormous cost had bankrupted the imperial treasury while empowering colonial populations who had seen European powers humbled by Asian enemies. Japan's swift conquest of Singapore, Burma, and Hong Kong had shattered the myth of Western invincibility, while the spectacle of European powers begging for American assistance had revealed the reality of imperial weakness. Throughout Asia and Africa, nationalist movements that had cooperated with imperial authorities during the war now prepared to demand the independence they felt they had earned through loyalty and sacrifice. The Labour Party's landslide victory in July 1945 brought to power a government committed to decolonization and social justice, yet facing the practical challenges of governing a global empire with diminished resources and growing opposition. Clement Attlee's administration inherited not only the burden of post-war reconstruction at home, but also the responsibility for managing the transformation of empire into commonwealth. The Prime Minister's quiet determination and his colleagues' idealistic vision would shape the decolonization process, though events would often move faster than London preferred. The independence of India and Pakistan on August 15, 1947, marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire, as the loss of the jewel in the crown demonstrated that even the most valuable territories could no longer be retained against determined nationalist opposition. Lord Mountbatten's accelerated timetable for partition reflected both British exhaustion and the urgency of communal violence that threatened to engulf the subcontinent. The creation of two dominions from the former Indian Empire represented both the triumph of democratic nationalism and the tragedy of religious division. The partition's horrific consequences, the displacement of 12 million people, and the deaths of perhaps 1 million more in communal violence, revealed the devastating potential of imperial withdrawal when accompanied by inadequate planning and preparation. The mass migrations across the new borders, with Hindus and Sikhs fleeing Pakistan, while Muslims abandoned India, created one of history's greatest refugee crises. Yet despite the bloodshed, both new nations chose to remain within the Commonwealth, demonstrating that political independence need not mean complete separation from British institutions and values. Mahatma Gandhi's assassination in January 1948 by a Hindu extremist removed the greatest advocate of nonviolent resistance while symbolizing the communal hatreds that partition had failed to resolve. The Mahatma's death shocked the world and deprived the independence movement of its moral authority, yet his legacy of peaceful protest would inspire liberation movements throughout the remaining empire. His philosophy of satyagraha had demonstrated that even the mightiest empires could be challenged through moral force rather than military violence. The Berlin blockade, 1948 to 1949, and the emergence of the Cold War transformed Britain from a global hegemon into America's junior partner in a bipolar world. The Royal Air Force's participation in the Berlin airlift alongside American forces demonstrated continued British relevance, while revealing the empire's dependence on American support for maintaining its global position. The creation of NATO in 1949 formalized this new relationship, with Britain serving as America's most reliable ally, while gradually abandoning its pretensions to independent great power status. The independence of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, in 1948, established a peaceful precedent for decolonization that would unfortunately prove exceptional rather than typical. D.S. Senanayake's leadership of a unified nationalist movement and the absence of significant communal divisions allowed for orderly power transfer without the trauma that accompanied partition elsewhere. Ceylon's immediate membership in the Commonwealth and its retention of British military bases demonstrated how independence could be achieved while maintaining strategic cooperation. The Palestine Mandate's termination in 1948 represented one of Imperial Britain's most spectacular failures, as the government abandoned its responsibilities without resolving the fundamental conflict between Jewish and Arab nationalism. The escalating violence between Jewish paramilitaries and British forces, culminating in incidents like the bombing of the King David Hotel, had made the mandate untenable while draining resources desperately needed elsewhere. The hasty withdrawal left behind a conflict that would generate regional instability for decades to come. Israel's declaration of independence and the subsequent Arab-Israeli war demonstrated how imperial withdrawal could create power vacuums that regional powers would fill through force. Britain's refusal to recognize Israel, immediately combined with its arms embargo that favored Arab states, reflected both Foreign Office anti-Zionism and concern for Arab oil interests. However, the new state's survival and military success revealed that British influence in the Middle East was rapidly declining, despite continued strategic interests in the region. The Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960, showed that imperial authority could still be maintained against communist insurgency when sufficient resources were committed and effective tactics employed. The Communist Party of Malaya's jungle-based guerrilla campaign posed a serious threat to British rule and the economic interests of rubber planters and tin miners. However, General Sir Gerald Templer's innovative counterinsurgency strategy, combining military operations with political reforms and economic development, gradually isolated the insurgents from popular support. The emergency's success in preserving British influence while preparing for eventual independence established a model for managing nationalist challenges elsewhere in the empire. The resettlement of Chinese squatters into defended villages, the recruitment of local forces, and the promise of independence upon victory demonstrated how imperial authority could adapt to new forms of warfare. Malaya's achievement of independence in 1957, under Tunku Abdul Rahman's leadership, vindicated the policy of fighting insurgency while negotiating political transition. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, tested Britain's ability to support American global leadership while maintaining imperial commitments worldwide. The deployment of British forces to Korea, including the famous stand of the Gloucestershire Regiment at the Battle of Imjin River, demonstrated continued military capability and alliance loyalty. However, the war's enormous cost and Britain's need to consult Washington before major decisions revealed the empire's subordinate position in the emerging Cold War order. The nationalization of the Suez Canal by Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser in July 1956 posed a direct challenge to British imperial prestige and economic interests. The canal's strategic importance for oil shipments from the Persian Gulf and its symbolic significance as the lifeline to the east made Nasser's action intolerable to the British establishment. Anthony Eden's determination to respond with force reflected both personal animosity toward Nasser and broader concerns about the precedent that successful defiance might set for other nationalist leaders. The Suez Crisis, 1956, marked the empire's final attempt to act as an independent great power and ended in humiliating failure that shattered illusions about Britain's global role. The Anglo-French-Israeli conspiracy to seize the canal demonstrated sophisticated coordination, but failed to achieve its objectives when faced with American opposition and Soviet threats. President Eisenhower's financial pressure, including threats to sell sterling and block IMF assistance, forced the withdrawal of British forces and Eden's resignation. The crisis's aftermath revealed the new realities of post-imperial international relations, where even America's closest allies could not pursue independent policies against Washington's wishes. The pound's vulnerability to speculative attack demonstrated Britain's financial dependence, while the military operations' technical failures revealed declining capabilities. However, the crisis also accelerated decolonization by demonstrating that imperial authority was no longer sustainable without American support, which would not be forthcoming for purely imperial ventures. Harold Macmillan's emergence as prime minister following Eden's resignation brought to power a leader who understood the need for managed retreat from empire while maintaining Britain's international influence through other means. His famous Wind of Change speech to the South African Parliament in 1960 acknowledged the irreversible nature of African nationalism while attempting to guide the decolonization process in directions favorable to British interests. The speech marked a fundamental shift in imperial policy from resistance to accommodation. The Gold Coast's independence as Ghana in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah's leadership established the precedent for African decolonization while demonstrating both the possibilities and perils of rapid political change. Nkrumah's charismatic leadership and his vision of Pan-African unity inspired nationalist movements throughout the continent, yet his increasingly authoritarian rule and economic mismanagement revealed the challenges facing newly independent states. Ghana's experience would be repeated throughout Africa as the imperial retreat accelerated. The Central African Federation's creation, 1953 to 1963, represented a final attempt to maintain white minority rule in Africa through larger political units that could resist nationalist pressure. The Federation of Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland was designed to create an economically viable state dominated by white settlers, while providing limited opportunities for African political participation. However, African opposition led by figures like Kenneth Kaunda and Hastings Banda made the federation untenable, while revealing the impossibility of maintaining racial domination in an age of decolonization. The decade of the 1960s witnessed an unprecedented acceleration in the pace of decolonization, as the winds of change that Macmillan had acknowledged became a hurricane that swept away centuries of imperial rule across Africa and Asia. The transformation was so rapid and comprehensive that by 1970, the great empire that had once governed a quarter of humanity had been reduced to a collection of small islands and scattered territories, most of which would gain independence within the following decades. Nigeria's independence in 1960 created Africa's most populous state, while demonstrating both the potential and the perils of post-colonial nation-building. The Federation of Northern and Southern Nigeria, with its complex ethnic and religious divisions between Hausa, Fulani Muslims, Yoruba, and Igbo peoples, reflected the artificial nature of colonial boundaries that had grouped diverse populations under single administrations. The country's enormous oil wealth and educated population offered promise for successful development, yet the Biafran War, 1967 to 1970, would reveal the fragility of these new African states. The independence of British East Africa proceeded with varying degrees of success and violence. Kenya's path to independence was marked by the Mau Mau Uprising, 1952-1960, a brutal conflict that exposed the ugly realities of colonial rule while demonstrating African determination to reclaim their ancestral lands. The British response, including the detention of over 100,000 Kikuyu in concentration camps and the systematic use of torture, violated the humanitarian principles that supposedly justified imperial rule. Jomo Kenyatta's emergence from prison to become Kenya's first president symbolized the transformation of terrorists into statesmen that characterized the decolonization process. Tanzania's independence under Julius Nyerere's leadership offered a more hopeful model of African socialism and non-alignment. Nyerere's philosophy of ujamaa, emphasizing communal values and self-reliance, attempted to create an African alternative to both capitalism and communism. Though his economic policies proved largely unsuccessful, his moral authority and commitment to African unity made him one of the continent's most respected leaders. The peaceful merger of Tanganyika and Zanzibar to form Tanzania demonstrated that artificial colonial boundaries could be transcended through visionary leadership and popular consent. Uganda's independence in 1962 began hopefully under Milton Obote's leadership, but descended into nightmare with Idi Amin's military coup in 1971. Amin's reign of terror, which claimed an estimated 300,000 lives, became a symbol of post-colonial failure and African despotism. The dictator's expulsion of Uganda's Asian population in 1972 destroyed the country's commercial infrastructure while creating a refugee crisis that tested Britain's commitment to its former colonial subjects. The eventual restoration of relative stability under Yoweri Museveni demonstrated Africa's capacity for recovery and renewal. The independence of Britain's Caribbean territories created a series of small island nations whose economic viability and political stability would remain dependent on external support. The West Indies Federation's collapse, 1958 to 1962, dashed hopes for regional unity, while revealing the narrow parochialism that often characterized post-colonial politics. Jamaica's independence under Alexander Bustamante and Trinidad and Tobago's emergence under Eric Williams demonstrated that these small states could maintain democratic institutions and economic growth, though their vulnerability to external shocks would require continued cooperation with former colonial powers. The Rhodesian Crisis, 1965 to 1980, represented the empire's most prolonged and difficult decolonization challenge, as white settlers, under Ian Smith's leadership, declared unilateral independence rather than accept African majority rule. The Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, posed a direct challenge to British authority while creating a rebel regime that Britain lacked the will or capability to overthrow by force. Harold Wilson's government's reliance on economic sanctions rather than military intervention demonstrated the limits of imperial power in an age of decolonization. The sanctions' ultimate failure to bring down the Smith regime revealed the ineffectiveness of economic pressure when applied to self-sufficient economies with external support. South Africa's assistance to Rhodesia, combined with continued trade with Portugal and other countries, enabled the rebel colony to survive for 15 years despite international isolation. The guerrilla war, waged by Robert Mugabe's ZANU and Joshua Nkomo's ZAPU, gradually weakened white morale, while demonstrating that minority rule could not be sustained indefinitely against determined African opposition. The Lancaster House Agreement, 1979, finally resolved the Rhodesian crisis through a negotiated settlement that provided for majority rule while protecting white minority interests during a transition period. Lord Carrington's skillful diplomacy, combined with pressure from South Africa and the reality of military defeat, convinced white Rhodesians to accept the inevitable. Zimbabwe's independence under Mugabe's leadership initially offered hope for racial reconciliation and economic development, though the country's subsequent decline would reveal the challenges facing African states attempting to overcome the legacy of colonial exploitation. The Falklands War, 1982, provided an unexpected revival of imperial sentiment while demonstrating Britain's continued capacity for military action in defense of its remaining territories. Argentina's invasion of the islands, prompted by domestic political pressures and miscalculation of British resolve, triggered the most significant British military operation since Suez. Margaret Thatcher's determination to reclaim the islands, despite their minimal strategic or economic value, reflected both personal conviction and concern for British credibility worldwide. The successful recapture of the Falklands after a brief but intense campaign demonstrated that British military professionalism and technological superiority could still prevail against third world opponents. The sinking of the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano and the loss of HMS Sheffield revealed the deadly nature of modern naval warfare, while the battles for Goose Green and Mount Tumbledown showed that British soldiers retained the fighting qualities that had built the empire. The war's outcome strengthened Thatcher's domestic position, while sending a message to other potential challengers that Britain would defend its remaining territories. The independence of Britain's Pacific territories proceeded gradually and peacefully, reflecting both the small size of these island populations and their continued dependence on external support. Fiji's independence in 1970 under Ratu Sirikamisisi. Mara's leadership created a successful multiracial democracy, though subsequent military coups would reveal underlying ethnic tensions between indigenous Fijians and Indian immigrants. The Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and other Pacific states achieved independence during the 1970s, while maintaining close ties with Britain, Australia, and New Zealand through the Commonwealth and various aid programs. The transformation of the Commonwealth from a British imperial organization into a voluntary association of independent states represented one of the most successful aspects of decolonization. The organization's evolution from the imperial conference system to its modern form demonstrated how institutional flexibility could preserve valuable connections while abandoning formal control. The Commonwealth's role in opposing apartheid, supporting development assistance, and promoting democratic values showed how former imperial relationships could be transformed into partnerships based on mutual interest and shared values. The handover of Hong Kong to China on July 1, 1997, marked the formal end of the British Empire as a territorial entity controlling significant populations and resources. The colony's return under the One Country, Two Systems formula, negotiated by Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher, represented the last major act of decolonization while demonstrating Britain's pragmatic acceptance of changing global power relationships. The ceremony at Government House, watched by millions worldwide, symbolized both the end of an era and Britain's graceful retreat from empire. Hong Kong's unique position as a thriving capitalist enclave under communist sovereignty reflected the complex legacies of imperial rule in the modern world. The territory's extraordinary economic success, built on free trade, rule of law, and entrepreneurial energy, vindicated the liberal principles that Britain claimed to represent, while revealing the potential for prosperity when imperial exploitation was replaced by voluntary cooperation. The anxieties of Hong Kong residents about their future under Chinese rule reflected both appreciation for British institutions and uncertainty about communist intentions. The empire's dissolution left behind a complex legacy that continued to influence global politics, economics, and culture long after formal independence had been achieved. The English language's emergence as the global lingua franca the spread of British legal and governmental institutions, and the survival of democratic values in many former colonies testified to the positive aspects of imperial rule. The Commonwealth's continued existence as a voluntary association demonstrated that political independence need not mean complete separation from beneficial relationships. However, the empire's legacy also included the artificial boundaries that created unstable states, the economic distortions that left former colonies dependent on raw material exports, and the racial attitudes that continued to influence international relations. The partition of India, the creation of artificial African states, and the displacement of indigenous populations created conflicts that would persist for generations. The moral compromises required to maintain imperial rule, from the slave trade to the suppression of nationalism, tainted Britain's claim to represent civilization and progress. The British Empire's transformation from a commercial venture into a global political system, and its eventual dissolution into a voluntary commonwealth, represented one of history's most remarkable institutional developments. No previous empire had governed such diverse populations across such vast territories, and none had retreated from power with such relative grace and minimal violence. The empire's evolution demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of human political organization, while revealing the eternal tension between order and freedom, civilization and exploitation, progress and tradition. As the Union Jack was lowered for the last time over Government House in Hong Kong, it marked not just the end of empire, but the completion of a historical cycle that had begun with the first English trading posts 4 centuries earlier. The merchants and adventurers who had initially sought profit in distant lands could never have imagined that their modest ventures would grow into a global system that would shape the destiny of nations and peoples across every continent. Yet the empire's ultimate transformation, from dominion into partnership, from exploitation into cooperation, suggested that even the most ambitious human institutions could evolve toward justice and mutual benefit. The British Empire's story thus ended, not with conquest or collapse, but with voluntary transformation into something unprecedented in human history, a global association of free peoples united by shared experience, common institutions, and mutual respect rather than force and fear. In this peaceful evolution lay perhaps the empire's greatest achievement and its most lasting legacy to the modern world.